I was above average height. I mean, I wasn't a very big person, but I didn't have a big physique, but I had a physique that would put the fear in a lot of the young people in those days.
Rudolph Springer grew up as the oldest of 5 siblings, and he took his role as the oldest very seriously, looking out for his younger siblings, trying to avoid trouble, and maintaining a no-nonsense attitude that others knew not to mess with. He didn't always have the greatest relationship with his father, but growing up in the CDC, he came into his own, and now he looks back fondly on his life growing up.
My name is Rudolph Springer. Most of my friends call me Goggles. I am the first of 5 children of my mother, Rosalind Springer, who was from Suffrage, and my father, Clement Springer, a musician by profession.
As you mentioned, your name is Rudolph, but you have a nickname as well. First of all, do you know how you got the name Rudolph?
I think my mother gave me that name because I was born on the 22nd of December, 1956. And I think because I was a Christmas boy and my mother was somebody who loved Christmas, she named me after Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Well, the history behind the name goes back to when I was 6 months old. And according to my mother, who was from Suffrage, I fell off a chair at her parents' home in Suffrage when I was about 6 months. And a wire on that chair impacted my eye. And for the first 6 months, I had lost sight in my left eye, that is, with only the white showing. Eventually, the black part, after about 6 months, the black part came through, but then that left me partially blind in my left eye, to the extent that if I cover my right eye, I cannot see clearly in the left. I'm almost totally blind, maybe 95% blind, but I can see things in the corner, but not very clear. And when I started going to school, I had difficulty seeing in those days what was called a blackboard. I think they call it a chalkboard nowadays. And as a result, my mother took me to an eye specialist who happened to be the sister of Michael Chasney, the father of our former Prime Minister, Alan Chasney. That was his eldest sister. She worked with the government as establishment, but she was an optometrist. And in those days, you didn't require any sort of college education to become an optometrist. But she had training, and then she told my mother that I needed to have glasses. So at about 6 and 7 years, she prescribed me glasses. And then I remember a Saturday, I went to her office. I went up there and I got my glasses a Saturday. And in the afternoon, going back home, one of the boys who I grew up in the CDC, David Popo, who was a twin of Davidson Popo, who died recently, unfortunately. He saw me with this contraption in my eye, and he was like, "Rudolph, where are you going with this thing in your eye? Are you going to dive? You have goggles. You're going to dive." And he started to call me Goggles. And then the name just stayed with me. All my other friends in the CDC area started calling me Goggles. I mean, it was a name that I hated. It got me into a lot of fights with a lot of my friends. But eventually, growing up, I kind of got used to it. But my mother never liked the name for me. All right, when people came to her and asked for Goggles, she would tell them, "Goggles, Papa." So that's really how I got, and that was in the year probably something like 1962. I was about 7 years at the time. when I went to Anglican school with my glasses, I was the only one in the infant and primary school for many years that had glasses, to the extent that when I was going to school, I would remove the glasses and put it in my pocket. Until one day, one of the teachers, she came to me and said, "Rudolph, what is it you have in your pocket?" I said, "Nothing." She said, "Yes, you have some in your pocket. Empty your pocket." So I emptied my pocket and well, I had to remove the glasses. And she said to me, "Well, why don't you have glasses? Why don't you wear it? I'm sure your parents must have paid a lot of money for you." And so I had no choice but to wear the glasses. I was born actually in Lansroad, because at that time my mother lived in Lansroad with my father, right? And out of the 5 children that my mother had, I was the only one that was born at Victoria Hospital. All the others were actually born at home, but in the CDC. Because at the time, my mother had a very close friend who was a midwife, but I was the only one that born at hospital at Lansroad, and I came to live in the CDC when I was 1 year old, until I left at 23 years to have my own boarding with my girlfriend at the time, who is now my wife, Agatha.
How would you describe yourself as a child?
I think I was very I wasn't growing up. I wasn't considered troublesome. I didn't like getting into trouble and being reported to by my parents. I mean, I did things, but very smart. And I think growing up, I had a temper, because I didn't like people taking advantage of me. Because growing up, I was what you call above average height. All right. In fact, I attained the height I'm today, which is 6'2", at the age of 12. And most of my friends were a lot shorter than me. So they looked at me as a giant. And I didn't take nonsense from anybody. I mean, if you talk to my friends today, a lot of them will say to you, "Boy, growing up, Gorgas was ignorant, because he never take nobody nonsense." All right. And because of my height, I think people avoided getting into any quote unquote fracas with me, because I wouldn't have it. But at the same time, I think I was a very nice person, very understandable person. You know, I think I was a decent child, a decent child.
Can you describe your family? So I know you mentioned you had siblings and stuff. Could you describe what are the dynamics?
There were 5 of us eventually in the household. There was me, Rudolph. I was born in 56. Josie came after, 2 years later. And 5 years later, my brother Tony was born. Then Tony, Serena, and your mother Christine came 1 year apart. Tony 63, Serena 64, Christine 65. To the extent that we were living in a 1-bedroom apartment in the CDC at the time. And because of all those children, my mother actually sent Tony and Serena to Suffrage to live with her sister at Suffrage. Christine was fortunate because she came last, so she was able to live with us in that 1-bedroom. In fact, Christine actually slept with my parents, while Josie and myself, we slept on a bunk which my mother bought at A.F. Valmore, somewhere around, I think, 64. All right, but the 1-bedroom could not accommodate all of us. So unfortunately, Tony and Serena grew up with my aunt at Suffrage, but they would come up and spend time with us for the summer vacation, Christmas vacation, the Easter vacation. And then they will head back to Suffrage, where they did their infant and primary school. Families that lived in the cities in those days were massive families. You had the Francis family, who had 10 of them, the Augiers. The Francis had 8, the Augiers who had 10, The Edmonds had about another 10. The Morlers had another 9. The Steels at the end had another number, another big number. So the family, the Menners had about 8. So the families were big. And so we were all like one family.
What was it like being the oldest sibling?
That was challenging. In those days, being the eldest meant that you had to take care and give guidance to the young ones. And my mother will always say to the young ones that if she went out and she left me in the house, she would say to them, Rudolph is the eldest, is in charge. You'll have to listen to him. And I follow that literally. All right. I'm sure your mother would have mentioned to you how sometimes if she doesn't behave herself, she would get some a spanking from me. So being the eldest, I commanded the respect of the younger ones.
What was your relationship like with your siblings growing up?
Oh, I think I had a very, very good one. Like I said, I was the eldest, so I was a disciplinarian, okay? But I had a very, very good relationship. I don't think that they feared me, but I think they respected me, all right? And if I say to them, don't do this or do this, they wouldn't bad talk or answer me back. They would just do it.
What were your parents like? How would you describe your parents?
I would describe my parents, especially my mother, as very disciplinarian. My father was that person also, all right. But my mother was the one in the house at the time with us most of the time, so she sort of dictated how we do things. And then if we went out of our way, all right, she would then report us to our father. And then when my father came home on evenings, like about 6 o'clock, 6:30, all right, he will get a report from my mother, all right, of any things that we did that she didn't like, and he would deal with us accordingly. My mother was a secretary. I think she told me when she came up from Suffrage as a young girl, a young teenage girl, she went to Kenlis College. Kenlis College was they call it Kenlis College, but it was a little private school on Waterworks Road. A lot of young girls went to Kenlis College. They learned typing, crochet, knitting, how to sew, all right? And my mother did that very well. In fact, she had a sewing machine, an old Singer sewing machine, which her mother gave to her, and she taught me how to use it. And but she worked as a secretary. I think she first worked with Menville and Chasney. And then when she lost that job, she ended up working with deceased John Bristol at insurance and agencies. And she worked there until she lost her job in 1979. And then my father was in the police band because at 14 years he was drafted into the police band because at the time the British government was looking to form a military band in St. Lucia, and they sent a gentleman by the name of Mr. Griffith to put together that band. So they recruited a lot of the young boys from the infant school, because in those days not many of the young boys were able to go to St. Mary's College, which was the premier secondary school in Castries for boys. I mean, even though they were very bright, but because the numbers were limited, they couldn't go to a secondary school. And in those days, you left the primary school at age 14. So he got recruited into that band at 14 until he was seconded many years after, I think in 1985, to the Ministry of Education as a musical instructor, where he taught music to a lot of the secondary schools that had come into being in those days, especially the comprehensive school, the St. Lucia Teachers Training College, and a few schools in the out districts. He also taught the Vieux-Fort Catholic Church Choir, and then he formed a group around 1971 called Hellenites, and produced an album of old folk music. So my mother was a secretary, and he was a what you call a band boy, but he had skills in joinery, and he also did picture framing for a lot of people and what have you.
Were there any family traditions that you had growing up?
Family tradition I can think of. My mother loved music. She loved to play music. And she loves the Mighty Sparrow. She loved the Mighty Sparrow. And she loved a lot of Caribbean music and reggae. And so on Sundays, when she went to church, 7:00 mass, and when she returned, she played her music. Because she had a lot of, in those days, what they call records. They didn't have CDs. She played a lot of her music from like about 8:30 to 4:00 in the afternoon. To the extent that that I too got to love music. I never played any musical instrument, although my father attempted to teach me to play guitar and saxophone, but I gave that up because I couldn't take on the licks on my fingers that he was giving me when I couldn't make a B note or a C note on the guitar. The other tradition was, like I said, maybe, I don't know if you call it quite a tradition, but we spend a lot of time at Suffrage, especially for the summer, Easter, and Christmas of vacation. And occasionally, my mother would go to Suffrage, and she took Josie and myself with her. In those days, we took the boat, which was then at the Prince William Basin, which is no longer there. In those days, there were 3 boats that you went to Suffrage. I think there were the Jewel, the Gerald, and the Canaries. These were 3 boats that ply between Castries and Suffrage. All right, but then most of the time when we were coming up back to Castries, we would take those big Bedford trucks, because you had to wake up 3:00 in the morning to take the bus by the Suffrage Square at 4:00 to come back to Castries, especially if you had to go to school the next day.
How would you describe the difference between your time in Suffrage versus the CDC?
Honestly, I didn't like going to Suffrage, but as a young person, before the age of 16, 17, all right, you didn't have a choice. You didn't have a choice. It was 2 different environments, or you call environs. In the CDC, everything was close by. You were just a throne's stone away from the commercial sector, the boulevard, the MNC, JQ, the cinema. At Suffrage, it was totally different. In my early days when I went to Suffrage, the family house that we lived in didn't have electricity. At nights, everything was lit up by lamp or by candle. There was no sanitary facilities like a proper toilet. There was a pit toilet. There was no shower to bathe. So we bathed in the sea, which was probably the thing that I loved the most. Bathing in the sea, which was not too far from, just a stone away from where we lived, and going there and jumping up the jetty where that's how I learned to swim. All right. So life was a big different when you went to Suffrage. You didn't have your bed to sleep on. I mean, you were not the only one in the family going to Suffrage. There were other cousins living there and some who came up. And there were probably there were 3 bedrooms in the house. One which my aunt lived, a second one which my grandfather lived with all his fishing contraptments, And there was another bedroom downstairs, which an uncle of mine who migrated to England in the 50s built. So when he come up to Suffrage, he would sleep. And my aunt would not allow anybody to sleep in that room. Nobody slept in that room. And so a lot of us slept in my aunt's room, which was a very big room, very spacious, but we all slept on the floor. We all slept. We had what they call the Creole term cabin. So we opened up our cabin and we slept on the floor. One thing that we did when we went to Suffrage, which I particularly didn't like, was my family had land up by the Peters. And sometimes early in the morning, we would walk to the land to go and look for mangoes and what have you. Which I didn't mind, but when you leave there, you have to carry those baskets of food on your head for almost 2 miles, and that wasn't that wasn't a nice thing. But you did it. The lady, she was on my case, so I ended up cursing her. Then 12 o'clock, I went home. About 1, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, there was a knock on the door.